That looks great. Why don't we get started?
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Becky. And good morning to each and every one of you. My name is Calvin Hill, and I'm the Vice President for Inclusion and Community Engagement here at Springfield College. Welcome to our Day to Confront Racism program. Today, you are invited to attend each of our 4 sessions, beginning with this one, The Past is Present, how the historical legacies revealed in the 1619 Project impact our communities, followed by John Brown, the City of Springfield connection to this abolitionist and accomplice. That'll happen at 10:50, followed by a moderated dialogue with members of our Legacy Alumni Group with a focus on moving the needle, and that'll happen at 12:15. And then we'll conclude our day with a moderated conversation with students at 2:40, focused on campus climate. Many thanks to our Legacy alumni for rekindling this idea that started some 50 years ago. I now have the pleasure of turning the program over to President Mary Beth Cooper, who will provide words of welcome. Dr. Cooper.
Thank you, Dr. Hill. Good morning, everybody. I have been looking forward to this day for weeks, and I hope you have been as well. It's a very important day for us to come together as a community and to continue our collective work, the work we've been doing for a very long time, maybe 18 months. But we now know, and we've known for quite a while, it's not enough. There is much work to be done. But I do think it's important for us to pause and have invited guests in to help us with greater understanding, and you're going to hear from a number of wonderful people today. I want to thank the Legacy of Color who have suggested this day happen. I would like to let you know this is going to be an annual event. We will do this yearly, and it'll be coupled with a State of the College, a look at diversity each and every year. We know, as we started to talk last summer, that words don't matter, action matters. And so I want to make sure that we stay true to our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it begins with each and every one of us. So I look forward to the day and look forward to hearing your comments and learning. With that, let's begin.
Thank you, Dr. Hill. Thank you, Dr. Cooper. I'm Becky Lartigue. I'm the director of the honors program here at the college, and I helped coordinate this event, and it's my pleasure to welcome and introduce our panel. The 1619 Project is both a collection of texts and a podcast series published at the end of 2019. First-year students in the Springfield College seminar studied it together last fall, and many other members of our college community have been discussing this work and its implications since its publication. That impressive project, led by Hannah Nicole Jones in collaboration with many other scholars, artists, and journalists, powerfully demonstrates the painful legacies of our country's defining contradiction that the freedom of some was built upon the enslavement of others. Inspired by Jones's explorations into how the events of 1619 echo in every aspect of American culture, from popular music to banking and foreign policy, in this panel, we'll hear about some of the long-lasting legacies of white supremacy and the racial disparities in the fields of education, the environment and healthcare, and journalism. Our panelists today will share some thoughts on systemic inequities that we as a community must continue to work to overthrow, and that work is part of being anti-racist. Each speaker will share some remarks, and there will be time for questions after each of the panelists has had a chance to speak. And you can submit those through the Q&A function, and those will be moderated. We'll share them with the panelists at the end of the session, which goes until 10:40. And there will be information for students who began at the college in the fall who are part of the Wellness Passport for you to sign on. So look for that in the chat. So I'll introduce our panelists just in alphabetical order. Keisha Green is a community-engaged scholar and critical teacher educator with research interests in English education, youth literacy practices, critical literacy, and critical pedagogy. She's published in numerous journals dedicated to education and social justice, and she's authored chapters and edited volumes including Humanizing Research, Decolonizing Qualitative Inquiry with Youth and Communities, and Youth Voices, Public Spaces, and Civic Engagement. Dr. Green currently serves as an assistant professor of teacher education and curriculum studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst College of Education, where she's the co-founder and co-director of the Center of Racial Justice and Youth Engaged Research, and co-editor of the highly acclaimed journal Equity and Excellence in Education, Dr. Green also serves as a consultant for area educational institutions supporting their diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. Welcome, Dr. Green. Samantha Hamilton has worked in the region for more than 17 years, showing her deep commitment to Springfield. Currently, Ms. Hamilton manages the Public Health Institute of Western Mass's Live Well Springfield Coalition. Through this initiative, she leads the Climate Change and Health Equity Initiative, which engages policy and advocacy to create strategies that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions, improve health outcomes for those of marginalized communities based in the cities and towns directly impacted by climate change, and dismantle systemic racism. Before this project, she led the Transforming Community Initiative and also worked with the Martin Luther King Jr. Family Services, where she supported state and federal grant initiatives around gang violence, substance abuse prevention, and teen dating violence. Ms. Hamilton is also a co-founder of A Queen's Narrative, a personal enrichment program for women and girls of color. A two-time alumna from our neighbor American International College, Ms. Hamilton earned her BA in Business Management and a Master's in Counseling Psychology. Welcome, Ms. Hamilton. And Kareem White. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar White, yes, named after the former Lakers, Bucks, UCLA Bruins legend, joined the ESPN production research staff in April 2007. Before that, he worked for the Jacksonville Jaguars and the Denver Broncos in the Media Relations and Community Relations Department. He received his undergraduate degrees in broadcast journalism from Florida A&M and his master's degree from Florida State University. He's worked the Centennial Olympic Games in Atlanta, 2 Super Bowls, and a BCS title game. He's part of the success of ESPN shows NFL Live, Winner's Bracket, Sports Center, and Mike and Mike in the Morning. He's been an ESPN talent producer for 8 years, specializing in the NBA, music, and entertainment. Welcome, Mr. White. So we'll go in alphabetical order. And as I said, please, we'll save your questions all for the end. So I will turn it over now to Dr. Green.
Hi, good morning. Thank you, Rebecca. Good morning, Springfield College. I am so excited to be invited to the space, especially since I'm a resident of Springfield. Live not too far from Springfield College. In fact, I have spent a few days and nights in your beautiful library and working on manuscripts and other things in my neighborhood. And I want to give a special shout out to a really dear friend of mine, not just friend, but sister and auntie to my kids. And her name is Felicia Lundquist, who I know is a very important part of Springfield College. And I know her work is extremely important in, especially with student affairs. I can't see my slides. Let's see. Should I share my screen or?
You can share your screen or I can share it for you. It's your choice.
Oh, okay. Okay. I sent the slides. I wasn't sure if that meant.
Would you like me to run them for you and you can just say next?
Yeah, that'd be great. Awesome. That'd be awesome. So as Rebecca mentioned, I am at UMass Amherst in the College of Education, where I have the pleasure of working primarily with secondary English language arts teachers and teacher educators, folks who want to influence the minds of young people and the lives of young people through literacy and language arts. I also have the delightful pleasure to work with Dr. Jamila Liscott. We're co-creating the Center of Racial Justice and Youth Engaged Research. And we're also co-editors of the Triple E journal, Equity and Excellence in Education. And I'll highlight some of these things a little bit later because I think that they relate to the topic. All right, so hopefully everyone can see these slides and hear me. I'm just playing with the title of the program today, and I appreciate your president for committing to this kind of event annually. I think it's critically important to have this kind of space and moments to pause. Awesome, slides look great. Thanks, Justine. Okay, so the title, also I love seeing people, so when I just see my slides, I feel a little disconnected. But with the title, I'm just playing with it a little bit. So I added future, right? So the title for this program is The Past is Present. The past is present, and I added is future. I think the historical legacies revealed by the 1619 Project also directly inform our futures. And so we're also imagining what our future possibilities might be. And this picture that you see is a picture from Ghana. I had the opportunity to travel there in January 2020 before all things shut down. And so it's kind of surreal to think that before our lives changed, my life changed by traveling to the continent and having an opportunity to go to West Africa, specifically Accra, and to experience the coast, right? And so if you've ever traveled there, you know that there are, yes, there are the remnants of the transatlantic slave trade, and you are able to tour the castles where enslaved Africans were held. And so this picture for me is connected to Nicole Hannah Jones, Jones's project, the 1619 Project, and thinking about how the legacies of slavery have had an impact on education in particular. And we can go to the next slide. So in my field of education, there are remnants, right? So there are remnants of inequities that are tied to the ways that we have viewed education. And so if you've ever read James Baldwin, you know that he has a really important piece called A Talk to Teachers. And in that piece, he's advocating for education to be a space, a transformative space. And he acknowledges that there's a paradox in education, right? So the hope is that when one undergoes or experiences education, they become enlightened and they start to question status quo, and they start to trouble and disrupt business as usual. And in fact, that's actually the kind of education that we so often grapple with, right? So those of us who are in the field of education know that there are tensions around preparing young people to pass high stakes tests and having students engage in standardized learning. And often this kind of learning does not engage the kind of critical thinking that James Baldwin is advocating that we experience in education. So I thought today for my remarks, I would just frame the ways that education has been influenced by the legacies of slavery as a part of our fabric and history in this country. And sort of the second-class citizenship, the ways that education is in proximity to whiteness, and the ways that now we're trying to sort of unlearn much of that. And I thought that I would play a short clip from Toni Morrison as a way to frame how we are now trying to move education in a direction, how we're trying to frame education now as a space for liberation and transformation. And so in my work, I build on culturally sustaining pedagogies, and I'm trying to create and foster spaces for young people of color to thrive and flourish, and so that they can feel as though the literacy practices, the cultural traditions, the identities that they come to school with are valued, and not just valued, but also centered. And so I wanted to play a short clip, and hopefully it will work. And in this clip, you'll hear Toni Morrison talk about how she's eschewing or throwing off or decentering the white gaze so that she can sort of be in her fullness and engage in storytelling for Black folk, not informed by the white gaze. So hopefully the technology works for you to hear it.
Sorry, Keisha, is there a
Yeah, it should be a
embedded?
link.
Yeah.
The white gaze
Not,
link.
oh,
Yeah,
let's see.
yeah.
All right, we may not have audio until I reshare. Let's see.
That's okay. I actually can talk through it. If you click on see more, folks can read her quote there. Yeah, just above her, yeah, yep. And so this is just a plug, right? So if you haven't already seen the documentary on Toni Morrison, check it out. This is a clip from that documentary, and she's just describing how, as a writer, she was often asked who she's writing for, can she write for the white audience, and she would often shrug that question off to share that that's not her job. And you wouldn't ask a white writer those same questions. And so in this clip, she's basically saying, I didn't want to speak for Black people. And I wanted to speak to and be among them. It's us. So essentially she's saying, I'm having a conversation and I'm writing for us. And so the first thing she had to do was eliminate the white gaze. And that's essentially what we've been trying to do in education. So those of us who consider ourselves critical scholars, critical education scholars, researchers, teachers, we're essentially trying to throw off this white gaze so that when we're engaging in the classroom, it's not in service of or to be in proximity to whiteness. And so at the heart of what I wanted to talk about today is just saying that the historical legacies mean that we're having to do a lot of work to remind Black children that they matter, that their literacy practices are to be valued, that traditions, cultures of youth of color are important, and that we value the knowledges of our communities. And in the next slide, I just share a number of important texts. You can skip that one. And so here you'll see a picture of Black children. This is actually from the Brownies book, which is a magazine that came out along with the crisis. So Du Bois was responsible for the Brownies book in the 1930s. And so this is really the earliest time that you'll see a text that's devoted to highlighting and promoting the culture, the traditions, the love, the genius, the joy of Black folk. And so when we think about the historical legacies related to the 1619 Project and think about the impact that it has today, we're having to remind Black and Brown youth of color that there is a history and that their lives matter and that it should be centered in the curriculum. And so when you go to schools should not feel like hostile places. Schools should not feel like places where you have to take off your identity and leave who you are at home. And so often I rely on the text that you see here, culturally sustaining pedagogies, teaching for Black lives, Black literate lives, thinking about how teachers teach successfully classrooms full of African-American children. Also, Goldie Muhammad has created a framework for designing curriculum for students of color, and a curriculum that engages identity and criticality. And that criticality is about social action. And so how is education changing the material consequences, changing material circumstances of our lives? And so basically thinking about how school is not school for school's sake, but school is a place where I can learn how to be civically engaged and how to change my communities and be a community organizer, community leader. I can go to the next slide. It's so, as a teacher, it's so different not seeing everybody. And so I wanted to highlight the Center for Racial Justice. It's a space where we are reclaiming schools and education as a space for transformation, as a space for liberation, as a space for centering Black lives, Black joy. And so at the center of our work is celebrating the genius and the joy of Black folk and the knowledges of Black folk. You can click next. And so through this center, we are amplifying BIPOC youth voices. We believe that young people should be at the center of ed research. They should be at the center of thinking about what education looks like. And communities must be at the center of racial justice in schools, ed research, and teacher education. Often what you might find happens in teacher education or ed research, there are a lot of adults and whiteness is centered. And so here we're trying to be disruptive and also think across disciplines, think outside of education for ways to rethink and reconceive how we do school. Next slide. And so this is just an invitation to check out our website. We have several programs. One is called a Racial Healing Lab. And in that Racial Healing Lab, we've invited middle school students of color to think about what it looks like to name the ways that inequity and racial injustice has impacted their lives. And so in these spaces, the Racial Healing Lab is a space to think about critical race theory. What is that? And how might that theory help young people name what's happening to them? And then as a result of being able to name and understand what's happening to them, develop youth participatory action research projects as a way to address, redress, confront, and change their circumstances. So in addition to the Racial Healing Lab, we also have these 5 areas of impact, and they are racial equity, critical teacher education, community engagement, youth leadership, fugitivity, and abolition. And through these areas, we're thinking critically about how, for example, critical teacher education is the space where white teachers are thinking about whiteness and thinking about their own identities and thinking about their relationship to their students and thinking about how and as a consequence, our understanding of who we are influences the way we teach. So pedagogy and instruction. And then for the community engagement piece, again, we're sort of being disruptive by inviting communities to be a part of our scholarship and practice. And we can move ahead to the next slide. And I mentioned before that another way that we're sort of being transformative, we also are co-editors of Equity, Excellence, in Education. It's an academic journal housed at UMass. The 4 editors or are pre-tenure faculty members, and that in and of itself is pretty radical. Typically, positions like this are held by associate professors, and certainly not the norm to have 4 Black editors at the helm of an academic journal. And we see this as an opportunity to think about the voices that are amplified in scholarship. And so again, thinking about the legacies, historically, ed research has been framed and narrated by folks who don't look like me. And so here's an opportunity for us to shepherd pieces by folks who are part of our communities, researching in our communities, and engaging young people and thinking about what equity and excellence means. We can go to the next slide. Our inaugural issue talked about what equity and excellence looks like and means. And so we recently had a kitchen table dialogue. And in this dialogue, we try to engage in conversations that look like my cousins and my sister sitting at the kitchen table in dialogue about what does it mean to do it for the culture? What does it mean to advance the culture through the arts, through intellectual engagement, through activism? And so in this issue, you'll find pieces by scholars, mostly scholars of color, talking about what it means to engage in thinking about the reconceptualization of education for students of color. And we can go to the next slide. And what we're most excited about these days is the upcoming launch of the center. And so I hope that many of you listening will tune in April and register for our launch, which is April 21st through the 23rd. Across the 3 days, you will experience young people talking about identity, talking about community organizing, talking about Black futures, racial healing, wellness practices, all of which are required for racial justice. And we have renowned scholars, including Sean Ginwright, Bettina Love, Cynthia Dillard. We also have a youth panel featuring folks like my goddaughter, Aaliyah Hall, who for 1 year and counting has been reading books every day during the pandemic to encourage folks, add joy and happiness to our lives while providing some really critical content to young people and adults. So we're really excited about this moment and hope that folks listening will register for this upcoming event. And we're calling it Black at the Center. And we're thinking about how anti-Blackness is at the center of injustice and inequity. And so what does it mean to undo anti-Blackness? What does it mean to work in service of liberation? What does it mean to have a Black ethic? And these are questions that are so critical considering our legacy of enslavement in this country, considering how the residue of enslavement in this country has often looked like the resegregation of schools or second-class citizenship, or a curriculum that was Eurocentric, a curriculum that didn't speak to the lives of young people of color, and in particular Black folks, or education that has often looked like marginalizing young people of color, often looks like young people of color receiving more of the disciplinary, punitive, on the end of punitive disciplinary practices. Also looks like not having enough teachers of color and certainly not having enough Black teachers. And so these are the kinds of initiatives and questions that we're asking ourselves in the wake of the 1619 project. So I'll stop there. I've rambled a little bit. I'm most excited about the Q&A, and I look forward to engaging folks when we have time to have conversation across the panelists and Q&A from the audience.
Thank you so much, Dr. Green. And we will do all of the questions at the end, but that was a great introduction to some of the great work that's happening in education. So Ms. Hamilton is going to speak next, and you want to run your own PowerPoint, or would you like me to? Okay, perfect. Thank you. Take it away, Samantha.
Thank you, everyone. Let me get back to this share slides. So again, my name is Samantha Hamilton. I am the Live Springfield Program Manager at the Public Health Institute of Western Mass. I work in the community around climate change, health, and equity issues. I want to speak in the practice of how to keep the 1619 project in mind and how you work with residents that are facing these systemic issues. And first, I want to recognize that sometimes the issue of climate is not considered a racial justice issue in the context of it's a global issue. A lot of people are dealing with it, but the inequities of climate shows up in who gets served first, what communities are prioritized in the needs and have access, as well as when there's a global natural disaster, what communities are most vulnerable to these issues. And predominantly, they're communities of color and they're low-income communities that are feeling the brunt of climate inequities and climate change. The other piece is that the work that I do is around climate change, health, and equity. And this is where we look at the intersection of how climate changing events, health outcomes, and equity have impact. So this intersection says that, again, the folks that are most impacted by this issue are communities of color. The folks most vulnerable are communities of color. And the folks that will have the most disparate health outcomes are communities of color. So our intervention strategy is to understand this and work with these communities, the communities I serve and also the community I live in, to figure out what our solutions are for these issues. So I'm going to scroll down on my slide. Scroll back up. So one of the most powerful quote that impacts me when I think about my work is that our role is to help other people see that the death of George Floyd, not just a single terrible event, but as part of a long-standing, ugly, ongoing tragedy that runs through American lives. And I know that it might stray away from, well, what does that have to do with the issues of climate? But any social injustice in any system or ism affects everyone. So the issues of police brutality has ripple effects on community. The issues of climate has ripple effects. And the issues of health disparities have ripple effects. But also we can't look at one issue in a vacuum. I can't say, let me just focus on climate and ignore the issues that are happening around the world. And our funding partner, the Kresge Health Plan Foundation, has recognized that racism is the root cause of many of these health disparities and systemic issues that's happening in our communities. And when we recognize and also talk about what's happening in these other categories, then we can find ways to find common solutions, strategies across the spectrum of health and wellness. So I want to speak to the work that I do in the coalition work. So the Live Well Springfield Coalition is comprised of 30 community organizations that work together to work on sustaining cultural health for Springfield residents. And we do that by looking at the social determinant health needs of communities. We look at their healthy eating, active living, built environment, economic outcomes as housing and education. And we've worked on projects related to age-friendly cities, climate change and health equity, which I'm going to speak more of, food access with our mobile market, the built environment. The built environment is with the way we get around, our walk, play, bike, ride. How do we get to and from our places that we live in? As well as issues related to resident and community engagement. We've done studies on livability through our road study project that looks at, if we built it, will people have impact? So if we change the built environment, would people then have the opportunity to have more access to walkability and livability? And then our other grant project was around Transforming Communities Initiative, and that focused on tobacco advocacy, focused on, again, the built environment, smoking in the residential housing, as well as food access issues. Through our efforts, we were able to, with community partners at the table, we were able to work with the city on a longer-standing project to get a culinary and nutrition center in Springfield, where most of the time our foods are outsourced. We're able to make Springfield a Tobacco 21 city with youth engagement, and that allowed us to kind of push out the tobacco retailers out of the school system by making a 21 requirement. So we've done a lot of advocacy around changing policy, systems, and environments that we believe that can also help dismantle the issues of systemic racism. When you can change the laws that exist in a community through policy advocacy, when you can look at the infrastructure and systems like the school systems, as well as early education systems, when you can change policies in those systems or how they are functioned, you make change. And when you can change the lived experience, condition, environment that folks live in, then you can have impact. So those are kind of the priority policy strategies that we take in order to make change in community. This image is show just the community partner bandwidth that we have. Like I said, 30 community partners, very diverse perspective of the work that they do. They have specialties in either food, service projects. We have community partners around higher education. We have partners in the hospital system, but all these networks come together to convene and kind of work together on changing the environment for the city. In this specific project, our partners were Livable Springfield, Neighbor to Neighbor, Wayfinders, which is a big housing community partner, Arise for Social Justice, Pioneer Valley Planning Commission. So they were the lead partners in pushing forward this effort. So like the why this is important, why climate change and health equity is important, is that Springfield is considered the asthma capital of the US. We have one of the highest rates of asthma disparities and asthma visits in our hospital systems. So a lot of young people have issues with asthma, and a lot of older adults. But in our advocacy, in our knowing this, in us knowing that we have the worst place for folks to live that have asthma issues, we as a community are fighting the issue of a biomass plant in the city of Springfield. So this biomass plant will be burning wood wood particles that will go up in the air, and that would then trigger and exacerbates asthma for residents in Springfield. So when we talk about the issues that we're fighting for, there's still current issues. Like the question we would ask ourselves is, why in the worst place to live would it still be possible for big development to put the worst thing in a community like a biomass plant? And that advocacy that we're fighting against is that we know as a community that it doesn't make sense, but the policies and the loopholes that these industries are able to get through is preventing us from even shutting down this opportunity. There's still legislative effort to kind of figure out how can we get rid of this opportunity of building a biomass plant in Springfield. And the argument that the narrative of the big businesses is that biomass is clean energy. And there's no scientific documentation that burning wood would be clean energy for our community or for any community. So we are working against false narratives around benefits. We're working against the narrative of this is a job opportunity for communities versus the fact that we are already in a terrible health related space with a lot of disparities, and we shouldn't be adding to it another big infrastructure, which is a biomass plant that would then make it extremely unlivable for communities. So this picture depicts Zoma and her daughter and her mother, who has issues of asthma. And this is what our community looks like. These are black and brown, beautiful families that are living in a condition, and they're also fighting against this condition in their communities. So an outline of the work that we've done over the last couple of years is that we were funded to look at climate change, health, and equities. And we were looking at these policies that were created in a climate action resiliency plan to improve livability for older adults and address greenhouse gas emissions and CO2 emissions. So we convened stakeholders, we had informed sessions, we established a committee. We worked with community stakeholders to narrow down these policies to a certain amount that we'd present back to communities. We held community engagement events. We were struck by the pandemic and we had to pivot our work to do something different. We had community conversations with residents virtually. We had workshops, and then we kind of narrowed down our work to one of the two policies that we hope to implement in the city of Springfield. So this is a high level timeline, but the slides, we kind of go a little bit deeper on what that work to look like. So the process that we take is kind of critical to how do you make change in the community, and you don't want to kind of come in and say, hey, I'm going to fix this problem for you, or we know what the answer is. So I'm strategic in thinking about like my role. I am a Springfield resident. I live in Springfield. I frequent I frequently pass through Springfield College when I go on my morning run. So I'm familiar with the campus, and I've been on the campus plenty of times. So I'm local. I am a local resident, a person that works in the community that she serves. So we recognize that my role as a resident is important, and as a woman of color in this position is important. And I also coined that I am also a gatekeeper in this process. I have powers afforded to me by being in this position, and I'm mindful that even in my position of power, I have to recognize my limitations and also try to work with community to ensure that I am not speaking totally on behalf of them, but I'm representing their voices the best as possible. So the process that we take is in establishing our outcomes, making sure our communities have key terms and understanding about what we're saying. We do evaluations, and we've done some surveys, community-wide ranking surveys to get perspective. We did a lot of community engagement because, again, this issue is a community issue. I cannot craft the issue myself. I need to work with community to craft what the issue is as well as what the solution will be. And then also we engaged a steering committee of residents and stakeholders to help us kind of work through the plan all the way to the very end. So what does the narrowing process look like? So like I mentioned before, we had a climate action resiliency plan which was established with the City of Springfield and other PVPC planning partners of Rise for Social Justice. This plan said, here are these things that we could do in our community to address climate change, health, and equity issues for residents. There was 156 policy ideas. We focused specifically on housing and transportation based on the grant guidelines, which brought us to 26 policies. Then we did a feasibility assessment to say which one is feasible based on what we know about the information and efforts to drive these initiatives forward, and what is kind of happening in our community that could also motivate an action to push these policies forward. We worked with our Climate Change and Health Equity Committee members to prioritize it down to 4 policies that we were confident that had great impact and could be seen in the community. And then we took those policies ideas to the community in a community-wide ranking process to get their feedback on which of these policies would have the best impact in community. So this is an example of the narrowing process in our meeting when we were in February, right before the pandemic hit, and how we were kind of looking at each of these policies and how they affect greenhouse gas emissions, how they affect health outcomes, and how they impact health in folks. And then we pivot our efforts to virtual learning. We went to remote learning, and one of our residents said that this work is still important to me, despite what is happening in the world. Climate change is still an important issue. So our residents stuck with us virtually to continue the efforts of what we were doing. So I want to frame how we are doing our work. I'm coining this transformative community engagement process. We want our work to be clear, and we want to be clear that the goals and objectives are easy to understand by all stakeholders, the residents and the stakeholders at the table. It is transparent, that participants understand everyone's role, who's doing what in the process, that the process is cumulative, that each action step is leading to the next outcome, that is transformative, that I might be the one in the initial beginning leading the agenda, but I am shifting my role and responsibilities over time, that I'm no longer leading, but someone else is taking on the role, and that we can actually see transformative change through our efforts, whether it's a policy being made, whether it's the capacity building of our residents.
bear with us. We may have to get Samantha back on the call. I regret that. We all have dealt with the problems of the internet. So perhaps we'll get you ready, Kareem, and we'll see if we can get Samantha back on. Oh, it's me.
Okay, just let me know either way.
All right, so I'm going to do a little housekeeping for a second while we get ready for that, and we'll give her a minute or two, and possibly she can get back on the Zoom. In the chat for students who join the college, remember you want to sign up for the Wellness Passport, and you want to click through to that link for that pilot this year. Let me see if I can. Let's go ahead, Kareem, and we'll start with you and your remarks, and then hopefully we'll be able to get Samantha back on. I'll reach out to her. Wonderful. Welcome back, Samantha.
I apologize on my computer.
No, we were gonna queue Kareem up early and hopefully get you back on, but this way we can finish you out, and then Kareem will take up when you are done. So thank you. Everyone has experienced what you have experienced, having a call freeze up on us, or we will just handle it the best way we can. So you can pick up where you were if you want to screen share, or if you, I think you're close to your wrapping up remarks too, as ever you choose.
Yes. Okay. So back to this transformative process. So yeah, our goal is that folks feel that change is happening, and that they're contributing to the process. So to wrap it up, so here's some examples of the work that we did in the community. Like I mentioned, our community conversations, which engage residents. We did this in English and in Spanish. We did a community-wide survey, getting 146 residents to respond. We did a climate change and racial justice workshop. So we wanted to intentionally talk about the connection between climate change and racial justice work, and show folks that there's a lot of intersection in why this work is important and why racial justice work matters in our climate change efforts. We also wanted to talk about ways to take action, and flexing your civic muscle workshop was the next place for folks to say, if you feel excited enough about what you're doing, you want to make change in your community, here's a place where we can do that. And we work with city council folks, state reps to kind of talk with residents about how policies are made, how systems work, and how their voice can impact change in the community. We also did these community pitch videos with residents leading to talk about why these policies were important. So the policies that we wanted to work on was complete streets prioritization in previously redlined neighborhoods. You know, redlining was a big issue for communities, and it's still an issue because there's no funding that's really designated to really build infrastructure in communities that's sustainable. So we need to prioritize funding to these communities. We talked about doing a race and health equity impact assessment. So whenever there's new built infrastructure in a community, whenever there's new development, is there a space that we can assess what are the disparate health outcomes or equity outcomes if you built this here? For example, the biomass plant. We know with a race and health equity assessment, we know the health outcomes for that plant in that community. So if we know that's going to have negative consequences, we wouldn't have wanted that to be built in our community. And community choice energy, also known as community choice aggregation, is how we source our home. So this idea is that maybe we can source our homes with clean energy. And whenever you turn on a light switch in your home, you know that's powered by wind, solar, or air instead of fossil fuel. And another innovation is free and safe buses that if we were to do some development and offering free buses in the city, that's an equity, that has an equity impact for folks most dependent on public transit and are living on a fixed income. So those were the policies. And here's the neighborhoods that we were able to reach based on the survey responses. It's important to be as diverse as possible, get across the city if we could to help make change. So we were at least happy that we touched at least one neighborhood based on the community dynamics. And what did we learn from this process? Representation matters. Like our work, the workshops we did were very important that we did them in English as well as Spanish, that we were able to get diverse groups at the table and diverse age groups, and that we were also in the neighborhoods that we wanted to be in, that we were getting that feedback. So these are the policies, these are the two policies that are going to be pushed forward. A race and health equity impact assessment. The community really wanted this to be the something that we do. It was the top policy chosen. As you can see, 70% of folks picked that as number one, and then number one or number two. And then the second one was community choice energy, was the second policy that we're pushing forward. And you can see 50% of folks picked it as number one or number two. So that's the work. And this is another way to look at the ranking when it comes to the policies on how folks picked and chose what was most important to them. And from this work, we also figured talk to folks about who's ready to take action, who's ready to get involved. 80% of folks said yes, they're ready to participate and support these initiatives somehow. And that's important when you're trying to make systemic change. You need the folks that are most impacted by the issue at the table to tell us what we need to do to make change. So having their involvement is important for us in this project. And a lot of folks were also willing to participate in pushing forward the community choice energy initiatives. So to sum it all up, my perspective on how the work moved forward is that I'm engaged in community in the design thinking of the future change strategy. They're helping us tell us what needs to be done in their community to make change. And we're also understanding the systemic nuances of doing these things. Again, like I said, I represent my community. I am from here, I live here, I work here. I have the powers of being in this position, but I also feel that there's more power in the residents' voices that speak up about these issues than myself, because their voice is the voice that leads to sustainability. They're the ones that goes out and vote, elect folks, and invite their neighbors to make these decision powers. So when we want to think about how we do our work, I'm mindful of, feeling good about being a good person in the community, but also being mindful that if I wasn't here, this work needs to continue, and the community is the one that keeps this work going. So I want to thank you all for having me. Thank you for bearing through my technical difficulties, and I look forward to the questions and comments that come.
Thank you, Ms. Hamilton. And yes, gracefully handled. You're ready to go teach live all the time in a college classroom for when that stuff happens to the rest of us. So thank you. And we're starting to get some wonderful questions in the chat about the call to action, as you talked about. People want to know more about the biomass. So we'll do that in about 10 or 15 minutes after Mr. White gives us his remarks about the field of journalism and some of the legacies he sees, some of the obstacles, and some of the opportunities too. So Mr. White, I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky. Hello all. Good morning. It's great to be on this panel, and I'll just run through a few brief talking points of just, obviously this topic is pervasive, and it's huge. But I'll talk about a few areas in sports and in journalism, where the 1619 project directly correlates to what's going on right now, and some very much so in real time. One of the first areas I'd like to discuss is in the media that we see every day, and how the stories are told about Black, Indigenous people of color, and through the lenses that they're told through. In 2015, Dr. Cynthia Frisbee a University of Missouri professor, published an article about how sports media has a negative portrayal of Black athletes. And it's a multi-pronged article that discusses the why and the how. The why is because representation matters, and the reason that the negative portrayal took place is because 75% of the media members who reported on Black athletes were white. There were a disproportionate amount of Black athletes, of reporters covering Black athletes in sports that are 70% or better Black. So then your stories are only told through a singular lens. In 2018, 3 years later, the famed sports and race professor, Dr. Richard Lapchick, did his race. He does his annual race reporting card, race report card, and he also talked about the disproportionate amount of white reporters and more importantly, editors, because they also frame how stories are told throughout everything that you see. So when you see things in the media, you're seeing it through not only a singular lens, but not a lens that's reflective of the actual people who are on the fields and on the court. It's not apples to apples. It's not a direct correlation, considering the fact that you have a disproportionate amount of white reporters in the media, and you have a high amount of Black athletes. One of the things that stuck out in Dr. Frisbee's report was that she noticed that an overwhelmingly amount of the media failed to see these athletes as humans. They only saw them as commodities, which was a direct correlation to how people viewed enslaved Black people, during slavery. It's one of those things that has been perpetuated now over centuries, and it's still very relevant today. More on the journalism and news side, as recent as over the past 3 months, we've seen several media outlets. I won't name them specifically, but we've seen several media outlets reporting and perpetuating what is known as the big lie. 2 months after Joe Biden was elected president, and that also furthered the racist narrative about Black and brown people's votes being illegitimate. And this is also a situation where representation matters. If you have more diverse newsrooms, if you have more people of color and more Black journalists to frame and tell the narrative and be in decision-making positions, it also provides and helps tell stories as a whole and tell accurate stories without a slanted lens. One of the second area that I want to touch on briefly is really just the effect of racial disparities in journalism and what it does for the business as a whole. Current Washington football team. I see someone in the panel has commented. So the current president of the Washington football team, Jason Wright, mentioned, and he's a big champion of diversity. He mentioned that diversity is good for business. And he has the stats and the information to prove it, to back up his point. Wright formerly worked for the McKinsey company, a consulting firm, and they recently published a report. They recently published a report in the Hollywood Reporter and in Variety that the TV and film industry leaves $10 to $12 billion in annual revenue on the table by not resolving its inequity issues when it comes to Black inclusion. And that's one of those things that also it directly correlates to the 1619 Project, which also widens the wealth gap, which is the widest the wealth gap currently is the widest it's been in almost 5 decades. One way, and I'll get into this later as well, one way to remedy this problem, especially since the numbers bear it out, is to have more Black, Indigenous people of color in decision-making positions. He is Black. To have more Black people in decision-making positions, and to not only have more equality, but to have more equity when it comes down to decisions, when it comes down to hiring practices, and to have that equity and diversity from top to bottom throughout your organizations, whether it's in a media company, whether it's in a sports organization, or whether it's in TV and film. And in all 4 areas that I mentioned, they also have a disproportionate amount of white people at the top. One of the third area that I will touch on, and this is something that I've seen with my own 2 eyes, as well as I've experienced. So I could say from a personal standpoint is nepotism and cronyism. And nepotism and cronyism is widespread throughout not only journalism, it's also widespread throughout sports journalism, and it's widespread throughout sports. They all intersect because the model looks very much so the same. It's what Dr. Lartigue and I talked offline about, how it's one of those secret areas, one of those hidden below the surface areas of racism, of systemic racism, that you don't see and that you may not recognize until you look a little bit below the surface. One of the areas, without going too far into it, is that I would challenge everyone on the inside of this panel to, the next time that you look at whether it's network anchors in sports or in television, to just look at some of the last names of some of the people who are reporting your news or reporting your sports. And there's a good chance that in some cases, nepotism and cronyism has come into play. The way that it stifles diversity is that nepotism and cronyism maintains the status quo, which also simultaneously shuts out Black and Indigenous people of color of opportunities. One of the lines that it's more infamous more than anything else when sometimes you hear about hiring practices is the person in the position of power went with someone who looked like them. Well, if nepotism and cronyism is taking place, then the person that looks like them rarely is a Black Indigenous person of color, which also perpetuates, systemic racism and furthers inequities in our particular field. A couple solutions to the issues. Well, before I go any further, I'd like to mention how nepotism and cronyism also affects sports, and not just sports journalism, but sports as a whole. You know, I want to put it in a very real-time 2021 term for you, is that, and this is also how it goes back to the 1619 project. If a couple hot button topics that have been in the sports world, definitely over the last 15 years, but very much so in 2021, is when you'll hear the phrase called skipping the line. One of the issues that caused a firestorm within sports was the recent hiring of Steve Nash to the Brooklyn Nets. Nash had no previous coaching experience, but had worked as a consultant in a front office for an organization, and played in the NBA for a long time. But he was handpicked by the Nets because of his previous other candidates interview, but he was hired by the Nets because of his previous relationship with the general manager. It caused a firestorm because it opened up Pandora's box about other qualified candidates who he may have skipped the line. To Nash's credit, he admitted that he did skip the line and that he was afforded this opportunity. As you look around the sports world more, you will see that the power and the equity lies in the head coach, the front office positions, and the owners' positions. And that is disproportionate and is not reflective of the players and the athletes on the field, where they are 70 and 70+% black on the field, and they are the commodities. And the people with the power and the equity, the head coaches, the general managers, the front office executives, and the owners are all disproportionately white, which again goes back to a portion in the 1619 project where they discuss the plantation system. The commodities are the ones on the field, and the people with the power and the equity are not. One of the other solutions to this issue is, as I mentioned earlier, would be to have diversity in decision making, to start with diversity in decision-making positions from the top to the bottom. You can still have diversity within your organization, within your news, media, or sports organization. But if it's not in positions of decision-making or power, then one of the byproducts of it is that people who are either entry-level or mid-level sometimes feel afraid to speak up because they are not in positions of power and influence. So I will also, I see a question in the chat. I don't know, Becky, I'm pretty much done with this part of the presentation.
Wonderful.
I didn't know if you wanted me to answer the question. I just saw it.
Let's try to transition to our Q&A. We just have a few minutes. And so I want to make sure that everyone is aware. And actually, if Ms. Hamilton and Dr. Green would put your videos back on. In the chat, I've added the rest of the day's activities. And so I hope that many of you will be able to attend some of the additional sessions. And we have time for just a few questions. It would be lovely to let the panelists weigh in. I think they've given us a lot to think about in terms of representation in management, in text and what we teach, in our entertainment venues, in sports, and the importance of stakeholders being involved in the policy decisions. You all said that very, very well. So if people could help us express our appreciation for the panelists by typing in the chat, they can see that. words of thanks and appreciation. And if you can put your questions in the Q&A, we'll be sure to catch them that way. Yes, it's hard when you don't see your audience's faces, but a lot of appreciative comments there.
Would you like me to start with a question?
Thank you, Justine. Yes, please.
Thank you to all the panelists. This has been such a rich, thought-provoking couple or hour and a half. So we have a few questions. I know we're at 2 minutes to time, so we'll just see what we can do. The first question is for, I believe, Dr. Green. Could you speak more to the white gaze and how it impacts current literature being published and how it impacts the reading of classic literature?
Sure. In the interest of time, I'll be brief and just invite the person to email me. Feel free to be in conversation. I tend to cite Toni Morrison whenever talking about the white gaze. So I recommend reading the text Playing in the Dark. And there are other pieces of literature and scholarship that talk about how we think about the canon, how has the canon come to be? And is the canon still relevant considering our students in the classroom? And so when I think about the white gaze, I'm thinking about how we might reconsider text selection and reconsider the ways that we engage our learners. And so when we think about literature, my hope is that we consider diverse texts by authors of intersectional identities. And so, and often what often happens is we also have a canon within multicultural literature. So even in selecting diverse texts, sometimes we default to that one Langston Hughes poem or, the singular Zora text, while those are among my favorite texts and worthy texts to take up, the idea is to think about all kinds of authors with all kinds of identities, and not just authors, but also plots and protagonists and stories. And so who and what is represented in the literature that we include in the classroom. And so that's part of decentering the white gaze, so that we're not telling stories that are singular narratives. We're telling stories that are more representative of the diverse textures in our classrooms, the plural nature of our classrooms. So, we're having students with multiple identities, right? So it's not enough to just say sort of, this is Black literature, right? So in that, there's speculative fiction. There's, a range of texts that we might invite, graphic novels that represent different kinds of ways of thinking and being. And so that's what I'm suggesting we consider in classrooms.
Thank you. Our next question is from Haley for Ms. Hamilton. How could the campus's healthcare students and public health students help educate themselves and others about the biomass plant that is scheduled to be built? And there were many kind of comments and questions in the chat around this too. So,
yes, thank you, Haley, for the question. So there's a lot of advocacy happening around biomass, and it's so the devil's in the detail regarding this policy. It's in the legislation, and what we're working towards and understanding that if biomass was written out as not clean energy, they would not get the energy funds to even build. So that's how quickly something could be dismantled if folks were more aware. But so I know that I saw Tanisha on here. She's from Arise for Social Justice, and they work with the Springfield Climate Justice Initiative, who's been advocating for this. I'm happy to also share my email to connect folks. So there's advocacy happening, there's letters to the governor happening, and there's organizing happening. And also we want to get the right legislators to kind of push forward this effort. So that's how folks can get involved. This is a longstanding issue. We call it the zombie that won't die, because they've been battling this for years now. And it's all in the details, and that's why it still lives. So I'm happy to share that information and connect campus students to this advocacy initiative, as well as any projects under the Live Well Springfield Coalition.
Thank you for that. And I am so sad that we have to end this so that the next event can get set up. But thanks to all of our panelists for wonderful, wonderful, thought-provoking and challenging work that you're calling us to do and that you are leading in. We will definitely make sure that we continue these conversations. And if you're willing for us to share any of your contact information, we would love to connect and continue these conversations and get additional allies and accomplices on board. So please be on the lookout, attendees, for follow-up opportunities to take action. Thank you.